welcome to our studio guests today and to fellow travelers out in cyberspace, thanks to that non-stop stream of zeros and ones. My name is Peter Gobets, co-founder of the Zero Project and moderator of the International Conference/Workshop on Zero. The Zero Project is a three-stage affair. There's a book project, an associated online event, and the in-depth research program to follow. Today, session number 19, and Professor Mayank Vahia, contributor to the monograph on Zero book project, will share with us his wide-ranging interdisciplinary view of mathematics as it bears on the invention of zero. Our panelists today were speakers in earlier sessions: Dr. Marie Naville, Dr. Celestine Zhu, Professor Jeff Oakes, Professor Alexis Lavie, if he shows, Professor Jim Ritter, and Professor Friedhelm Hoffmann. We also have a special guest, Sudeep Bhattacharya, professor at the Tata Institute for Fundamental Research. As such, we have experts representing the 6 major players in the zero story: Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, India, the Islamic world, and Europe. We even hope to soon identify and invite a specialist in Mayan mathematics. Our focus throughout will remain fixed on the distinction between the placeholder 0 and the number 0, if any. Dear Mayank,
Yes.
please do set the pace for today's discussion, if you would.
Okay. So first of all, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak. I've been listening to all the 18 sessions that have happened so far, and there are a lot of things that are sort of interrelated to that. So I'm going to try and take a broader perspective than usual, which is to talk about general perspective. Now, before I start, I want to apologize in the sense that after listening to all the languages, I have sort of tried to create a formalism, and I'm really grateful to Peter for all the help that he has given me. He has answered my endless number of questions with great patience and sort of overlooked my ignorances at times and all that. So I'm grateful to him. I'm really grateful to him. So based on that, I've created a framework which I'm going to present today, and that's going to be the primary presentation. And my hope is that it will interest you. I don't think you will agree with a lot of what I will say. So a lot of what I will say will be controversial and could even be wrong. I don't claim perfect knowledge, and therefore there will be things that will be wrong, and there will be things that will be controversial. But I don't think Peter should be blamed in case there are errors in my presentation. And so I apologize in front for the mistakes I make. But the idea is not so much to have the last word, but to have the first word. The idea is to get you into thinking on a framework of zero and related issues. That's my perspective for the day, and that is my objective for the day. So I personally believe, having looked at everything that has been said, is that I think mathematics rises in 4 different stages. Early trading, early agriculture, even foraging people need some ideas of basic numbers because they need to count how much they've got, what they've got, and all that. And therefore, the placeholder 0 equivalent, whether it is blank, whether it is dot, or everything used up and nothing remains, kind of a perception, etc., comes very early in human brain evolution, as far back as 10,000 BC. When farming comes in, an additional idea gets added to the whole scheme of perception, which is geometry. How much land do you have? A square-shaped land, a circular square-shaped land is obviously easier to till, and so on. And so these ideas of geometry come in. In India, we have an interesting side in that, in the sense that the earliest form of Hinduism requires fire altars to be made to sort of pay our homages to the gods, and the gods are supposed to collect their fire homages that they are put in the fire. And because all gods are different, you cannot have the same shaped pyre for everybody. So there are different shaped pyres. On the other hand, the fire cannot be unequal between gods, otherwise the one who gets the lesser, smaller fire will get upset. So the early concentration of Indian mathematics has been in squaring the circle. If you have a hemispheric fire altar and a square rectangular fire altar, how do you make sure that they have the same area? But the idea is the same. The idea is of geometry, shape measurements, area measurements, not so much volumetric, but definitely area measurements and so on. Then by the time you come with sufficiently advanced urban settlements, the whole arithmetic becomes more complicated, because there are multiple people involved, like the blockchains, etc. There are multiple people involved, multiple tradings involved, etc. So then mathematics becomes more advanced, and you actually end up with the problems that we give to children, saying John is 5 years elder than Smith, but 3 years elder than Harry, or whatever it is. Kind of multiple simultaneous equations can come just in the trading. I've sold so much to so and so, I sold so much to somebody else, etc. So complex arithmetic, according to me, comes up once urbanization comes. And I have put this date as 4000 BC. It's in many ways an arbitrary, but generally to give you an idea, not so much of the date as of comparative time scales. And at this stage is something that all cultures reach very early in their sophistication, when they have established farming and established settlements and taxation and everything is there. All cultures would reach this stage without well, just by flux of time. Beyond this stage, then it becomes culture sensitive, according to me. What will be, where will mathematics go next, will depend on the perspectives, and interest and perspective of the society as much as needs. And that is what I'm going to talk about. So, according to me, at this stage, formal mathematics comes in, and I put 500 BC. It should have been 500 AD. So 500 AD as the time when the formal mathematics comes into the comes into being, and that is where mathematics is now treated as a language. It is no longer treated as a utilitarian item, but the whole concept becomes language, and there are interesting consequences to that. Today, Peter sent this email about the Nider's formulation of human comprehension of zero, and I thought it made a lot of sense. So I have stolen directly from his email. And he says there are 4 stages of mathematics. He says the first is the most primitive, especially comprehension of zero. He says the first and the most primitive stage is the absence of a stimulus. Nothingness corresponds to a mental neutral idea that I had 5 sheep, I've given her 5 sheep, now there is nothing, the ground is blank, and that is a reality without comprehension. Then there is a second stage which says that no, I have none means I no longer possess any, and there is a qualitative difference now in my possessions, as it were, because I may have something else in favor of this, but I no longer have that sheep or whatever, have become zero. The third state that comes is that it requires a meaning in a very comprehensive sense of the word, where actually the null and the zero start making sense, and you start worrying about and in an abstraction, a number line equivalent of ideas of 5 minus 3s and stuff like that. And the fourth state that comes in is when the empty set actually starts beginning to make sense. And then you talk about null sets and set with zero element and so on. These different stages of the concepts reflect progressive levels of mental abstractions and pave way for a full-blown number theory. And this is what I've taken directly from Peter's email. So, but I thought this was an exciting summary. So I would like to sort of add my own bit of analysis to this. There is no doubt that the work is of great significance because it assigns development of software of the brain with the brain connectivity and social evolution. And in the context of other places from which we have knowledge of brain, it makes very interesting because it is an important line of thinking about zero. So we have known, for example, activities change brain. So taxi drivers, for example, are known to have a much larger area of the brain where maps are stored. You and I need much lesser maps than a taxi driver does, so those areas are actually better developed. Similarly, mothers can pick up resonant sounds of their children and so on. And we know that the brain can tune and retune to stimuli. The old people are asked to continuously work on problem solving, etc., to keep their mind going, otherwise it would be stratified. That we have known. And this is also true, of course, of accumulated experiences and subconscious experiences and so on. The reason why this work particularly struck me was that it shows that even zero or the absence of stimuli generates cognitive signals, and there is a cognitive response to changes in the information, even related to bring. So this was something that had, sort of caught me by surprise. I always thought zero was just one of the entities and number lines, etc., arithmetical skills, and there was nothing profound about zero. But it turns out that things are more profound than what I used to think until today afternoon. So, and even more interestingly, our brain size is smaller today. So, our ancestor 15,000 years ago actually had 1500 cc's of brain. I have only 1350 cc's of brain. Today, average human brain is 1350 cc compared to 1500 cc. While some of this has been associated with just increasing efficiency of the wiring of the brain and getting rid of the fat from the brain cells and so on, and improving the communications. But it has also meant that we have lost some of the skills. If I was to go and try and live in the Serengetis, an animal would be able to kill me with ease because I do not any longer have this sense of um, stress comprehension, of risk comprehension, and so on. So some of this loss of brain has come at the cost of increased efficiency, some at the cost of loss of some other comprehension. So the idea that zero also has the idea of nullness and zero has a profound effect on the mind is something that is fascinating, and that's what I learned today afternoon. Um, but I still want to return to the older point of mathematics becoming a language. So at this time, about the mathematics becomes gets disconnected from the rest of the simply utilitarian application of arithmetic. So at this stage, mathematics disconnects itself from the utilitarian arithmetic, and people work on problems just for the pleasure of working on this problem. It becomes a creative activity of the educated on its own. And that is when the perspective changes. That is when everything changes for mathematics. Because it is now a language and henceforth developed as a language. You take the vocabulary, you make sentences, essentially equations in different contexts, and see what things look like, or create series, create sequences, worry about geometry and algebra of the geometry and so on, and start worrying about those issues. And according to me, more complex algebra beyond the linear extension of the above ideas is is something that a culture will come across provided it is predisposed to that. It is not that there is something profoundly different about Indian culture. I will just make that point in a while, that it was predisposed to thinking of these ideas while other cultures had other preoccupations. The Egyptians were busy making pyramids and all the issues related to it. The Greeks' philosophical ideas were, were beautiful in their own way, etc. So different cultures have different perspectives. It so happens that in India, for various reasons, this is a line of thought that took a lot of attention of the people. So it was used. Originally the excuse for developing the astronomy, the mathematics in India was astronomy, but a lot of them was not astronomy. So we had sine functions, cosine functions, and eventually go all the way to differential equations. But these were more developed as an idea in a language rather than utilitarian. It therefore borrowed a lot from philosophical ideas and other languages that were around at that time. And one must remember that whatever the development in mathematics India had, it was never used in real world. The credit for bringing mathematics to science is something that should be credited individually to Isaac Newton and to Renaissance in general. So till here, even though for all the beauty of mathematics that were developed, etc., it was a language. It was a language of the learned. It was a language in which people debated various aspects of mathematics. It was not connected to sciences. It gets connected to sciences when Newton's laws of motion are written down and so on. So in fact, I think Isaac Newton should be taught not only in physics classes but also in classes of philosophy and history, because it was a attitude changer for human beings, and in that sense significantly more profound than simply the laws written down. It brought mathematics back into sciences. Till then it was not in sciences, it was a language. um, so different cultures evolve different levels of mathematics based on their needs and their preoccupations. Most have come easily from complex arithmetic and even devised tools to help them make complex arithmetic equations as easy as possibly. The Chinese developed various tools to do that and all that. However, it would take, I would like to suggest that algebra as part of the history is a certain cultural attitude which would take people to sort of deviate into these kind of fields and go beyond simply the arithmetic part of India. And my contention is that Indians happen to be the first one at this because they were culturally predisposed, and that is what I'm going to talk about in a little while. So, impact of mathematics as a language was that the concepts, various ideas of other languages got translated into mathematics, including philosophical ideas and so on. So, for example, the questions was what was the result of kind of questions that came up as one of the structures, including limiting value theorems and differential equations and estimations of pi, and great lengths to which people went to try and minimize the error in measuring pi because of the Havan contention, and eventually simply an obsession with area and volumes or linear size and areas. In this abstraction, the connection to reality was not a necessity. So you just took a sequence and asked yourselves, where is it leading? It didn't have the numbers no longer had a quantitative association, which is a major difference between algebra and arithmetic. It did not have a value association. That value association would be brought by Newton much later. The reason why I think Indians went on to do this is because they took to the language with a gusto. So the culture of studying mathematics and the beauty of that language is something that became a cultural undercurrent in amongst a lot of learned people across the landmass of India. And when I say India, I mean India, Pakistan, in a very general sense of the word. They explored the ideas of algebra. They came up with trigonometry by 5th century AD, and they came to limiting value theorems and differential algebra by 13th century and so on. But it was still a disconnect. Okay, but they never considered applying these problems to real life, except maybe in astrology, but not in astrology. So there is no astrological calculations. All those are 13th, 14th century and later. They were interested in astronomy, when the eclipses would occur, how the eclipses are to be calculated, what are the equinoxes and all that. So that fascination remained, but it was not something that was in any sense a real life problem that they worried about. So when they encountered zero in all this, they had already been preconditioned to accept zero through other languages. Philosophy, religion, and so on had given them a certain predisposition to be comfortable with zero. So they sort of incorporated saying, okay, now here is also where we have come out with this idea of zero, and let us look at it. So basically, the manifestation of thought, zero and thoughts, comes in a variety of ways in India. The first, of course, is philosophy, where you have this Nasadiya Sukta, which talks about the whole universe having come from nothing. So that null emptiness, the transientness of everything, the very definition of God as being neti neti, neither this nor this. You cannot give a positive definition of who the God is. Meditation required you to stop thinking, consciously block thinking. The idea of Buddhism, etc., were all related to this idea of sort of a predisposition towards the idea of null, and null being an integral part of the construct. Then in grammar, Panini, in order to consolidate the language or compactify the language, wrote down the rules of grammar that existed at that time. Sanskrit is an orally transmitted language, and because it was orally transmitted, they had to make sure that the transmission is as perfect as possible. If you want to make the transmission as perfect as possible, then the individual vagaries, a person who speaks a different language at home, his pronunciation or her pronunciation should not come and hamper when you are reciting the Sanskrit slokas. So elaborate exercises were done, both to make the language as compact as possible in terms of grammatical rules, which allowed you to merge words and so on, but it also allowed you a whole bunch of other rules. So there are a whole set of rules which are used to check the oral transmission of Sanskrit being accurate, irrespective of what your pronunciation in your native languages are. So there, this idea of sandhi and the idea of combining words and merger of words and the idea of using null to merge words so that they are still easy to recite without working about the details is something that would make that kind of zero very comfortable. So there's some 5 or 6 kind of zeros in Panini. How do you make a sound disappear? Has elaborate 6 or 7 rules on disappearance of sound. And then, of course, there were mantras, there was these recitations in which there was this interplay of various priests and all that. And then there are sections of Samved, for example, which have mantras which have the sounds have no meanings. There are no dictionary meanings for the sounds that are created, but those are created for rhythmic purposes. So the idea of meaningless words being used effectively as communication means or to create the environment of that Havan, etc., was something that was not uncommon to an Indian mind. Then mathematics, zero as counting location-based device is something that comes from Babylonia, as we've seen earlier. But the idea of stringing, the idea of arithmetization or the algebraization of zero is something that comes in 5th century AD, because people are just curious about it as an idea. And then zero in the arts comes in many, many. There's a beautiful lecture by somebody in this sessions about how art comes when you blank your mind and let your subconscious decide what you want to do with the canvas or whatever you want to do with the medium you're using in order to express your mind. So this idea of blanking the mind is very common. Somebody actually, so one of the speakers actually associated with the idea that it is a death-like experience, where you are completely unconscious of the reality around you, and let your mind come and tell you, let the subconscious come and tell you what is to be done. So the idea of nulling of mind is something that is predominant. In fact, even if you look at books like Mind in the Cave, etc., which speculate the early rock arts and all, there are a lot of abstractions there. And the belief is that these rock art people took hallucinogens and then grew them, because the abstraction levels are quite out of ordinary for somebody with that kind of visual experiences. So this idea of nulling the mind in order to be creative and to create is quite fascinating in its own right, and in some sense its own null. And then we have modern zero of science, which is essentially a zero in physics chemistry, where you balance forces, you null them. There are three great zeros in physics, which one is the mass of a photon, one is the temperature, and the third one I don't remember. But there are basically three zeros: vacuum, empty, vacuum, and singularities. In computers, of course, zero and ones, as Peter said at the beginning of this talk, that zeros and ones are the ones that make the computers run, and there are various variations. So there's the zeros are vague. For a hardware engineer, anything that is less than a volt is zero, and anything that is close to 4 or 5 volts is considered 4 or 5 volts, which is what makes digital circuits so strong, because there are a lot of error tolerances in that zero. So there are various levels of zero. There are highly tolerant zeros in computers within a certain range. Zeros have some fundamental zeros in sciences and some relative zeros in sciences. The idea of letting the mind wander uncontrolled by human thought or consciousness is something very common to art. Mathematics, of course, is fascinated just with the idea of having um, number zero and what do you do with number zero. And so there are fascinations like that. Grammar uses nulling effects quite effectively in order to make language recitable, and recitable without error, because that was crucial to that story of recitations. And of course, philosophy, the whole idea comes from null. And I have a little comment to make at the end about why this null was so comfort, was an idea that the Vedic people played with so much of comfort compared to what Europeans did. So European, and I will come to that comment at the end. My last slide will be that. So there are forms of zero. So Hinduism has its own idea, Jainism has, Buddhism has, everybody has its own idea of what entities are and what are zeros. Then in philosophy, there are various kinds of zeros. Similarly, in meditation, there are kinds of zeros. In music, there is definitely an idea of nulling and let your mind flow and not actually try to understand the music. Sanskrit grammar has a priori non-existence, a posteriori non-existence, absolute non-existence of sounds, and so on. So Pani defines 6 different kinds of nulling or zero, um, essentially lopa of sound, in order to make the writing recitable. And then modern physics has absolute zeros and relative zeros. And then there are physical zeros of null points and singularities. There are mathematical zeros of arithmetic, algebra, and zeros of equations, and so on. And of course, computers have their own uses of zeros. And you can make a network of it. You can ask yourself, what does the connectivity look like? What is the relation between each of these set of zeros? So what you essentially do is put the connectivity between those two and let a net diagram run it for you. Then you get a cluster of zeros which are religion associated, where there is this vagueness of ideas. In Christianity, for example, it will be much weaker. On Hinduism, it becomes very normal. So Hinduism, for example, sits right over here, while let me see if I can get it. laser pointer. So Hindu zero sits right in the middle with multiple connectivities. Islam, Christianity are rather apprehensive about it, so they only have second level connectivities. Then grammar has its own set of zeros and nulls, and the way the nulling is done in grammar and all. Then there is zero, which is metaphysical, of non-existent zero and the Buddhist zero and so on. Then there is zero that is abstract zero, where there's absolute zero and relative zero of sciences. And then there are, of course, physical and mathematical zeros that make their own cluster of their own right. And music and meditation, as you would expect, sit closer to religion and grammar and philosophy, because those zeros are essentially interplay of those kind of ideas. So you can actually put in your relative emphasis or connectivity between various ideas of null that we saw in the previous slide, and then ask a network diagram, what does it look like? And you get a very nice and very sensible actually graph on its own. This is untaught. It teaches itself based on the connective links that you give. And you get this nice connectivity of sounds. And then so there is this zero F Indian contribution also increases. So Nasadiya Sukta, for example, in Rigved itself, 1200 BC talks about the zero from which the entire creation comes. On the other end, the formal zero is about third century BC. Then meditation brings in the form of yoga and the six darshans by 200 BC or so. Zero in mantras come from Samved itself. The zero of grammar comes from Panini. The zero of nature comes in a very nice book called Nyaya Vaisheshika Combination, which talks about this idea of zero. And there were some questions. I'm still looking for exact Vaisheshika reference. I've seen 2 or 3, but I'm not absolutely sure of them. And then there's the idea of Anu, which in some sense is connected with these ideas. And then, of course, Bij Ganit, Brahmagupta brings up his own arithmetic. And zero becomes interesting. Zero becomes cipher, and eventually Shunya becomes cipher and zero. But the other word for zero in India, as used by Aryabhatta, another is Kha. And Kha is still used in various forms in Indian language today to show emptiness. So if something is over, if mother says the food is over, she will say the food is khalas, which means it's gone, it no longer exists. Brahmagupta zero, of course, is series computations and curiosity about how to with zeros. So in 628 AD, he comes out with this idea that number should be interpreted in such a way. So it would have to be, at this stage of algebra, it was in some sense a natural requirement that they would come out. So you had these two classical arithmetical zeros, which everybody understood from 2000 BC or so. And then he went on to add other rules, multiplying by zero, dividing by zero, which initially he thought 0 by 0 could be cancelled and stuff like that. Then he comes out with the refinements, exponents, and so on. And then solutions to the functions of 0 and so on. And the fx equal to 0 is something Indians don't do. It comes out later on when other situations come in. So Newton worries about fx equal to 0 when he wants to balance in sciences and so on. The bottom line of what I'm trying to say is that 0 is natural even in to even basic mathematics, and hence it is every culture will come up with that discovery of 0 very early. On the arrival of complex trading practices, geometry and arithmetic get mixed up, and eventually some groups of people will start worrying about the pure abstract level, no longer associated with entities. So numbers are no longer now associated with individual quantities, and you have this abstraction of algebra where 0 gets seriously investigated. And I again want to emphasize that bringing it to science is something that Newton did. Indians did not do that. They just enjoyed the pleasure of doing pure mathematics for the pleasure of pure mathematics. And the reason why I think Indians were predisposed to mathematics is this. This is the picture from Central Asia, and the formative years of India's Vedic people were spent in this Central Asia's large open land spaces. And I mean, if you just go there for 5 minutes, and I had the pleasure of going to Kyrgyzstan, you cannot but be hit by the idea of nullness. There is a stillness in the nature where nothing grows, nothing happens, and in any way, everything is null. And so the idea of nullness would strike to anybody whose formative years were formed in an environment like this. Compare that with, for example, European environment. Rich, green, full of vegetables, things changing dynamically, things changing dramatically, animals coming and going here. Here there is nothing to see. And that beauty of nothing to see is the beauty that is that sort of gets ingrained into you very quickly. That nothingness, it's a very striking nothingness. So there's a landscape of Central Asia, which was the formatic landscape for people who would eventually settle in India and create the Vedic culture. This would define their perspective of the universe and nature. In this environment, it is impossible not to think of vast emptiness as being real and natural, an idea that would allow them to introspect on zero as naturally as in the language of mathematics as they had done in philosophy or grammar earlier. Other cultures with different experiences focused on different creative ideas in different other fields. It just so happened that people who were predisposed to nullness got into this game. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much for listening to me. And once again, I'm grateful to Peter and this organization for giving me this question, which I've sort of preoccupied my mind for last several months. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayank. That's unrivaled. I don't I don't think anybody can follow in your footsteps as far as the fluency of speculating across such a wide arc of development. But very grateful to you for sharing that with us. I would then like to go to the panelists because you will have all heard this talk by Mayank. He did caution us that he would be speaking very quickly, and so I'm not sure whether all of it would have come across. But Marina, as the lady in the group, we give you the floor. Would you like to react to anything that Mayank has said? Have any questions or comments?
My first comment is not about the core of the talk, which I found really interesting, but about the very beginning. I was fascinated by what you said about areas. So the idea that you had to have the equal areas, so different shapes, still. So they had to compute the shape of the area of a square, inside the square, the area inside the circle. So I found that very, very interesting. Can you tell us a bit more how they did it? Did they have formulas, or or every time it was sort of they gave numbers in every special case?
So they definitely had the algebra, in the sense that they knew about the Pythagorean triplets. They would actually try and approximate a square circle to a square, and they would take a square and see, take a rectangle, fit a semicircle to it. That's when they would find that the length of diameter to circumference ratio is pi, and which is not a rational number. So then they would go on to approximate pi values as all kinds of fractions were used, and they would realize that each fraction has a weakness. So they consistently try to improve the fractions which would define pi for them. So they actually take a square and try to take it into smaller squares, try to fit it into a semicircle, and with increasing precision they would try to do it. But then they had pi very early, and they had Pythagorean triplets very early. They didn't have the a square plus b square equal to c square, but they knew the sets where a and b, if they were rational of particular value, then you got the diagonal, which was also a rational number. So those kind of things come very early.
Okay, so if they have at some point two areas like a square and a circle, they could apply formulas or algorithms to compute the areas.
Yeah, that's right.
So that leads me to the second question. Then why did you say language appeared later? They used, wasn't that already using some language?
Yeah, so
What do you mean by language? That's my question.
Okay, what I mean by that early algebra actually had linear equations and quadratic equations because area is a square, but they were used simply in the context of creating something. People did not profoundly think about the nature of the equation. So for example, Pythagorean triplets did not lead to the Pythagoras theorem. Those kind of things. So they were just interested in creating these ideas of fire altars which were of correct sizes. What I mean by language is where you essentially sort of play with the basic grammatical structures in a manner to create new ideas or express new ideas without bothering about the connection to reality. And it's for the pleasure, and within it, so you said make a set of consistent grammatical rules, and then within those set of consistent grammatical rules develop your vocabulary to see how things work. In that sense, I would call a language as a different from arithmetic. So according to me, while as long as you are in the field of arithmetics, each number corresponds to an entity. When you shift to algebra, those numbers have an identity of their own without entity. So, for example, when we give children these picture books, we tell them one apple, two oranges, three bananas, etc., and then they transform these 1, 2, 3 from apple, oranges, bananas to completely abstract 1, 2, 3s. That transformation that a child does is actually a very profound transition that a child makes of removing or making these numbers identity independent. And in that sense, I would sort of distinguish the language and new utilitarian
Okay.
use of mathematics, arithmetic.
Okay, I understand. And so you date this abstract process going from 2 oranges
To Vahia, but I would associate. Yes.
You date it later.
Yes, much 580, as late as 580. So, good 1500 years after the utilitarian mathematics became routine.
Thank you.
Marina, the reason for asking that question is because that is your subject, right? Differential geometry.
Yeah, I mean the idea of right, in a sense. I mean the idea of comparing, having let's say a loop and computing the area inside and comparing. Yes, that's very much part of geometry.
Yes, just one thing. The extreme idea of using zero without an identity is in passwords. You can have a password which says 0325, and leading zero makes no sense in arithmetic or algebra, but it makes complete sense in using it as a password. So computer actually debases the associated values of zero, and I find that very. If you try to get Excel to write a leading zero, it's great difficult that you can do it, but computers use zero as password entity.
Right.
Okay, but
Yeah.
now
Thank you.
I always have to insist that the Zero Project is after finding fresh evidence of the invention of zero, and now we're way 2,000 years beyond, speculating about all the various uses of zero. So even though fascinating as it is, I must sort of constrain everyone to keep the focus on the early invention of zero, and whether there is a distinction between the early placeholders that show up and the number zero. Mayank has already sort of given an indication of that is quite a modern concept, and that we may be anachronistic by imputing that. Celestine, again, thank you very much for taking time out from your busy schedule. And we're sorry to burden you with this, but it's important for the overall balance of the Zero Project to have you here. So thank you for that. You've heard the presentation. From your perspective, from Chinese mathematics, is there anything that you would like to comment or ask questions?
Yes, and thanks a lot for your presentation, and it's very informative, and I learned a lot from your talk, and I try to compare with the evidence found in Chinese documents, ancient documents, but it's still hard for me to find the strong evidence to support the idea that some philosophical or religious ideas have the direct impact on the use of number zero in Chinese documents. And I will search it in more detail. And for your talk today, I have yes, I have some small questions for you. For example, in one of your slides, you showed us the relationship between so many areas, so many fields, the relationship between these fields. So I'm a little bit confused about how you connected them, and what's the role of the number zero played in this relationship in one of your slides.
Okay.
Thanks.
So what I have done is that, for example, if there is a null as an entity where something is missing, I would consider an equivalent of zero of definition. And depending on how important that idea of null is to philosophical ideas, I would keep that connectivity to null and mathematical zero at that level. There are some ideas. So, for example, algebra and arithmetic would have a very strong connection because the zero means literally the same thing. But in grammar, Patanjali's idea of lopa is a relatively weak transformations from the zero, that is the number, that is the entity that is played with by Brahmagupta. So that connectivity is weak. Zero to arithmetic connectivity is weak. But the idea of lopa and the idea of non-existence in philosophy, early ideas of creation of the universe, etc., those links would be stronger. So it is completely subjective. I agree with you. It's completely subjective about how strongly I think what subject is connected. But the idea is that it provides the network, and the idea is that even with my personally uncriticized or unevaluated idea of what is the connectivity between various ideas of philosophy and null, but you get a reasonably good graph and reasonably sensible graph. And the idea, the underlying assumption is that the null is the entity that is carried around. It is zero in mathematics. It is a placeholder zero in arithmetic. It is the idea that the universe comes out of nothing in philosophy and religion, and it is the idea of surrendering your thought to blankness for arts and creativity. So the null is the founding idea that runs underneath everything.
Sebastian, any follow-up?
Yes, I
Please.
see. And could you explain a little bit more about the music? You said the music is play a core role in the network.
Yeah, so music at its root is fairly mathematical in the sense that you can program any machine to do music because it is strictly programmable. It's highly mathematical in its structure and creativity. So a lot of musicians will tell you that in order to learn the music as it is formulated, especially in Western context, has underlying mathematical structures. So in that sense, music and mathematics that is one thing. Second thing, a lot of people who create new inventive music will tell you that the conscious part of the story is a fairly small one. When they actually sit with the instrument and play and connect with each other to see what the resonant sound is like, it's largely an internal construct, especially in Indian music where there are no orchestras, where there is at the most, if two musicians come together and create music, that itself is a big event. Each music is created individually by a person, so it is an extremely internal affair, and most of the time it is subconscious. And that's why I would put music in connection with this context.
Okay, thanks.
Sebastian,
Thanks a
yes.
lot.
Okay, thank you very much. Jeff, your chance to ask questions or comments.
First of all, I'm really grateful for the organizers for arranging such a wide array of viewpoints on zero. It's actually quite interesting to hear yours, and your whole approach is different from that of a lot of the rest of us, which is actually quite refreshing. So, but of course, I had to think of something intelligent to say while I was listening to your talk. So, one question I have for you is the relationship between algebra and zero, and how do you understand this? Is like zero a prerequisite for algebra, or the other way around, or because you did mention them in connection with each other?
Yes. Often I'm not so sure whether algebra came first and zero came first. Zero came later, or zero came first and algebra came later. But so, for example, when you do sine functions and trigonometric functions, etc., when the Brahmagupta astronomy formalized the play of zero, Aryabhat is already using zero as the coordinate system origin, already a sine function and cos functions which have zero value and so on. So the idea of purely algebraic zero is there in sine functions and so on. But then what Brahmagupta does is actually formally sit down and says, wait a minute, let me look at this entity and its operational alternatives. And then he writes down this x into 0 and x upon 0 and so on. But the idea of algebraic zero in terms of trigonometric functions, etc., is used by in Brahmagupta in 5th century AD. So I would think the zero was there, but the later gentleman simply sat down and worked out the formal equations that control the behavior of zero.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Jeff, follow up?
Well, if I were to follow up, I think it would last an hour and a half. So I think I'll pass on the follow up.
Okay, well, it can always be continued later. We'll be hopefully meet again on the 6th of March.
Okay.
And we can pick it up from there. Jim, you're at BAT. You've heard this. Can you, I was thinking while Mayank was speaking, especially about his contemplation about the landscape, on the effect of landscape on the mindset of the people. And since Mesopotamia would be up in that region also, do you see any connection between the landscape and the development of mathematics, the concept of the placeholder?
No. After all, Mayank warned us that this would be what he would say would be rather controversial, and indeed it is. One could argue, of course, that the vast deserts which surround Mesopotamia, surround Egypt, are as close to a metaphor for zero as you would like, but I would not claim that the Babylonians were influenced by the existence of flat, level lands to think of zero. So I see no evidence for that whatsoever.
Okay.
One could argue that, it must have been like that, but I don't find that terribly convincing without any sort of substantial, either written or pictorial evidence for it.
All right. Yeah, go ahead. Your actual.
I had a question. You pushed me into a response there, but I actually had a question, which is I'm a bit surprised by Mayank's claim that there is no connection between math and science before Newton. The thing that for Mesopotamia, obviously, but for India as well.
Sorry.
Of course, astronomy. You glossed over that, but I don't understand in what way either astronomy is not a science or mathematics was not applied to it in either Mesopotamia or in India.
Yeah, so I think, first of all, I owe an apology in the sense that I only meant it in Indian context. So in India, what happens is the caste system is very strong. So the construction work, the design work, etc., are done by artisans. And these Brahmin intellectuals would not interact with artisans to do the kind of things that Newton did. So when I said there was disconnect between mathematics and algebra, the artisan work or scientific work, it is only in the context of India's environment. I did not mean it as a general term. So, for example, in Greece, for example, Archimedes does a phenomenal amount of work, etc. So I should have explicitly said that I only meant it in the context of India's system of creativity. And astronomy was also used as a pleasure activity. It is not an activity. For example, astrology does not become part of India until much later. There are omens, etc., in the early texture tradition. But Aryabhatta, for example, does not tell you how to make a kundali or how to make a horoscope, etc. Those things are later in India. When Aryabhatta or Bhaskara talk about mathematics, they just talk about mathematics as a structure. In that sense, I suddenly realized that my PowerPoint should have explicitly said that this is true only in Indian context, that the two remain separated. Only in the Indian context.
Jim, does that answer the question?
I have other questions, but like Jeff, I'm sorry.
Please.
I don't want to sort of eat up the time that we have. So
No, please. This is why we're here.
okay, let me just make one point then, of all the things I would like to say. What your metaphoric extension of zero to all kinds of fields and areas and aspects of these different fields strikes me as raising a question about which has not been, I think, sufficiently explored by any of us, which is the relationship between the notational idea of zero and the actual mathematical object that we would like at some point to call or define as zero. And I think this notational question is important. To take just one example, which might be not from Mesopotamia at all, but from your reference to computer. We always talk about zeros and ones for computers, but of course there are no zeros or ones in computers. What we have are bistable circuits. And bistable circuits we could call red and blue, or Democrat and Republican, or 0 and 1. We talk about computers in a mathematical context, so we have a tendency to use 0 and 1 to talk about them. But of course, these are not zeros and ones. These are two states of a bistable circuit. So this question of notation, the zero, the notational zero and the conceptual zero seems to be an important point that you brought up to some extent, but I think we all need to think about and needs to be, I think, teased apart when we're talking about zero like that.
Yeah, no. In computers, the zero is actually a zero. What happens is that they build typical electronic circuits which operate on 5-volt current, 5-volt potential. And when the signal that comes out has a 5-volt potential, they call it 1. And there is an error. A good rugged electronic circuits will accept anything between 4 and 6 volts as 5 volts. And when no signal is to be given, they bring the voltage down to below 1 volt, and then it is considered zero. So when you read a time sequence, you actually read these voltages, which is 5 volts or 0 volts. And that is how they would connect to 0 and 1. So that is not a notional association. You can't do red and blue on that. It is actually for somebody who is designing electronic circuits. It is a real zero entity and a real zero. On the multimeter, it will show 0 for that milliseconds or so. So in that sense, it's a real zero.
Jim?
I would disagree, and but this is something to be going into later. Let me just stop there.
Okay, well, I would like to say something, because this is a point which often comes up. You know, people take it for granted, 0 and 1 computers, but it is not the on-off bistable that you're speaking about. The 0 and the 1 are two signs of a semiotic system that are related. The signs are related by the syntax, which allows the coding that computers need, not simply the on-off thing, but to have more complex coding. So that becomes a language, as far as I understand. I'm not an expert on that, but that's my understanding of it. I don't know if that, the question had come up before. I remember the first time I read it was that it was a notational issue, and you could have used any two other signs, but that would be missing the point that 0 and 1 are related in a semiotic manner that permit more complex coding. But maybe we're ranging too far afield there as well. Jim, thanks for that. I appreciate that you're being so restrictive, but then on the 6th of March, we'll get another chance. Friedhelm, you've been so patient. Any questions, comments from your side?
Yes, I've got two questions. The one goes back to the trigonometry you mentioned in India in the 5th century. You said to do trigonometry was just a pleasure for the highest caste. So, and in reality, for example, fields or distances or whatever were measured with completely different methods, and the ideas of trigonometry were not transferred to everyday life, right?
No, they were not. Yes.
So
They were not.
So the highest caste, they just saw maybe the other people measuring fields or whatever, and they knew the results are wrong, and they said
They wouldn't bother.
nothing. That's it.
They wouldn't bother. So the idea was that the king would use square fields, which are easy to calculate from early arithmetic.
Okay.
But more sophisticated. So, for example, there isn't even sophisticated architecture in India until much later. So the idea of having beams and balancing forces so that you can create something spectacular doesn't exist.
Okay.
The castles, etc., the fortresses that are built with very instinctive understanding of physics and densities and stuff like that. There are no greatly artistic designs in early Indian architecture. That comes with the Mughals in 13th century from Mughal area.
And my other question concerns the very beginning of your talk, when you gave an overview of the development of mathematics in 4 steps.
Okay.
And in the first step, which according to your presentation started around 10,000 BC, you mentioned the basic arithmetics there, including placeholder 0. This struck me. Placeholder 0.
Okay. Again, I think there was an error in presentation. What I meant was they would understand that if I have 5 cows and if I give away 5 cows, I'm left with none.
Yeah,
but this is all mental exercising. So it was placeholder in a very weak sense of the word. It is technically, in fact, now that you point out, I realize it's a wrong use of the word. But the idea was that to have no cows left with you, or and those kind of ideas would be there in early arithmetic. That's all I meant.
Okay. It was only, there should be only the idea, no cow is just
no, yeah.
no cow.
So null, the idea of 0, no cow, that's right. I will quietly change my PowerPoint before I do it the next time.
The good sport that you are. Finally, we have Sudip Bhattacharya, like I said, a younger colleague of Mayank and a friend. Sudip, you've been listening to all of this. It's your first turn with the project. What is your impression, and what questions would you have from Mayank, knowing Mayank as well as you do?
Well, thank you for inviting me, and it was a nice, thought-provoking talk with speculations and facts. So I had the same questions, and just now has been asked that 10,000 BC, and there was a placeholder. I would not call it a 0, but placeholder. I thought that placeholder would be connected to base value number system. But since that is asked, so other thing I would like to ask is I myself would make a clear distinction between the mathematical 0 and the philosophical idea of nothingness. So I would like to ask Mayank's opinion about whether we could have a mathematical 0 without a prior strong philosophical idea of nothingness.
Well, eventually, the moment arithmetic becomes algebra, you would have to have problems of how to handle 0 within those numbers. But the very fact that, and that idea made, for example, Europe came across the same problem, but it made them very uncomfortable. The Chinese came across the same problem and circumvented in a simply magnificent manner, where they could solve linear equations with zeros inside without having to worry about the identity of zero. So it was done, but it produced a sense of discomfiture in other cultures, which it did not in India, because they were sort of, since childhood, predisposed the idea that null can exist. That's what all. But for example, Chinese did go to solving linear algebra. That book of 9 problems or something is there, that actually solves linear equations which have zeros, but circumvents the concept of it, the discomfiture of it, in a very, very elegant manner.
Sudip?
So it would have come, but these people are predisposed to the idea because of philosophical and grammatical reasons. They're predisposed to be comfortable with that idea.
Sudip, you asked that question for a reason. Is that your point of departure, that it was necessary or that it was not? Sudip?
Yes. So so different people have different ideas about zero and nothingness. So my idea is basically it's the idea of non-existence. So I recently wrote something, and I basically divided nothingness into various kinds. So and non-existence, which is the absolute nothingness, I would personally think that without a very strong prior philosophical idea of non-existence, one would not possibly think of using mathematical zero. So it was a kind of a madness. It did not come from any, when it came, it did not come from any particular requirement. So everyone was fine without a mathematical zero, but it was still conceived, and the reason of that conception was just to name something, that non-existence was named in as a number, and then its mathematical operations were also conceived. So all these were, at that time, was a madness when it was conceived. Of course, now we cannot do without it, but when it was conceived, it was kind of a very high intellectual activity without a practical reason. That's what my idea is, but I would not go further.
Well, actually, that's very interesting, because that's also the working hypothesis of the Zero Project. Again, we may have to revise it if we're convinced. I know there's some people here on present today who may not subscribe to that idea, but from what we have learned, and it seems very plausible, is that if you do not have a prior evolution of the concept of nothingness, emptiness, then the idea would simply not occur to you, because the concept would have to evolve before the symbol, the sign assigned to the object, whether a mathematical object or another object. And that, again, this sort of resonates with what Mayank started talking about in the case of Andreas Nieder, that, if it turns out that cognitive science shows that there are individual neurons that are attuned to the numbers 1, 2, and 3, in the sense of, recognizing one object, two objects, three objects, which a lot of animals are capable of. But unless that brain connectivity is there, then the creature in question would simply not even be capable of it. So we tend to like to explore that very seriously, but again, open to being incorrect about that and finding some other alternative. It could very well have come purely from practice, but even then, purely from practice means that practice, whether conscious or subconscious, is always within a context. So it may appear to be purely practice, but even that practice would not have happened unless the capability of it had been there. So that's sort of the lines that we're exploring. Well, I think we've had everyone.
No, Dr. Hoffman wanted to say something.
Friedhelm, you have another question?
Yeah. The question whether the mathematical zero has the idea of nothingness as a requirement. Yes, probably. But if we follow Mayank, this idea was there at the latest 10,000 BC. So this is earlier than any written evidence from any culture. So even if the idea of these 4 steps of development are right, probably they are, it does not really is relevant for the question of the representation of zero in mathematics, right?
Mayank?
Yes, it is. In fact, it becomes the zero in mathematics becomes really interesting when the set theory formulation comes in. And that is when you have this quarrel between null set and the set with zero as an element. And that is the first time it becomes explicitly clear about what this entity is. So set theory formulation with its quarrel for null set and set with zero, and the difficulties that teachers have in explaining it to the students, where they associate numbers with entities and not the abstraction of ideas. And
So
as long as you are doing that, you have great difficulty in telling that the null set is different from a set with zero as an element.
Yeah, okay. You are speaking about zero as a number, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Zero is a number, yes.
Yeah.
So what happens is when children learn in school maths, every number is associated with an entity which may be abstract. From the first concrete evidence of 1 apple, 2 oranges, 3 bananas, they can abstract to 1, 2, 3 as entities, but it always in the back of their mind represents an entity. And then the set theory comes and says that a set with zero element and null set are 2 different things. That is when it strikes you that there is a difference.
Yeah, but in earlier cultures, like in Egypt, you do not have the idea of zero as a number, but you have a placeholder zero.
Yes.
Yeah, because you just consider the not existing of something. You do not consider it as a number.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct, and that is where the elegance is. By the way, if you're talking about these numbers and brains, just let me add 10 seconds worth of it. There have been studies which show that many people associate a particular number with a color. And that is because in the brain, the circuits that handle numbers and the circuits that handle colors are close to each other. And sometimes they tend to crossfire. So there are people who would say that number 5 is red colored and red color is number 5 and so on. They actually associate colors with numbers. In that sense, I have never seen what zero is associated with, but it may be worth looking at that literature, whether we associate a color to number zero.
Friedhelm, I'm surprised to hear that you say that the Egyptians had a placeholder zero, because that's news to me. It had a non-positional system. Unless you're talking about very recently, say, not the ancient Egyptians, but the later Hellenist period.
Right.
But the non-positional system did not need and did not have a place.
That's right. That's right.
Oh, okay.
They had words to express the non-existence of something.
Right.
And they used one of these words to express the idea if there was no number. Right. In later astronomical texts, when they use the sexagesimal system taken over from Mesopotamia.
Actually, that's the point I wanted to make in the presence of all of you, since it looks like the Egyptians, the Hellenists, in the Hellenist period, adopted the sexagesimal system and used it to effect. We probably should not be bringing them in as having contributed that aspect of it that was already in place in Mesopotamia and was taken or was adopted. So I don't know if you agree with me. It's all to their credit that they did, and they advanced their own mathematics. But The question is whether they made any original contribution beyond that, because the placeholder was already there. Am I wrong? Do you agree on that? What's happening?
Well, it was in Egypt. It was not only in the Hellenistic period. It was a bit earlier, when they were in contact with Mesopotamia. Yes, but they have it already in the 5th century.
But they didn't invent. They didn't invent it. They didn't invent it.
No,
they
certainly not. Yeah.
And the same with the Greeks, right? I mean, people try to associate this with some Greek contribution, but I personally don't see that. If it was already in place and it was simply the application of it. Okay, all right. Hopefully we'll get back to some of these aspects. I'd like to really thank all of you for having taken the time on your Sunday afternoon, evening. In China, it's quite late. So now, thank you for joining, and then please join us to the virtual audience the week after next to explore related issues to pinpoint, if possible, Zero's epicenter. At that time, we will meet Professor Cisir Roy and Venkat Rayudu Posina, his co-author, on the parallels between Indian philosophy and modern category theory, and as such linking philosophy and mathematics at the foundational level. So thank you again, and until then.